The Harper family was the picture of urban affluence. Richard Harper, a successful financial consultant, had built a career advising the wealthy elite of New York City. His meticulous professionalism was mirrored in his personal life, where appearances mattered as much as results. Richard was always impeccably groomed, his wardrobe a collection of tailored suits and silk ties. His demeanor was confident yet approachable, making him a trusted figure both professionally and socially. Margaret Harper, his wife, had devoted herself to their family and community. After leaving a high-powered corporate communications job, she had seamlessly transitioned into the role of a homemaker and socialite, becoming a familiar face at charity galas and community events. Margaret's charm, sharp wit, and organizational skills made her the linchpin of their social circle. Their sons, Michael and James, had been raised in an environment of privilege and high expectations. Now in college they were thriving, one studying law and the other engineering. The Harper brownstone, with its perfectly manicured front garden and tasteful decor, symbolized a family that had it all. But the facade was just that, a surface-level perfection that hid the crumbling foundation beneath. With the boys gone, the house felt larger, emptier, and eerily quiet. The dynamic between Richard and Margaret began to shift, the cracks that had formed over decades of routine and unspoken grievances now exposed. Their conversations became transactional, focused on logistics rather than connection. Margaret resented Richard's emotional absence, his tendency to bury himself in work even when he was home. Richard, in turn, felt trapped by the predictability of their marriage and the expectations that Margaret had of him. Their once thriving social life became a series of performances. At dinner parties, they played the perfect couple, exchanging knowing smiles and witty banter. But behind closed doors, they retreated to separate corners of the house, their interactions reduced to strained civility. The Harper home, once lively and bustling with the energy of two growing boys, now seemed desolate. Margaret kept herself busy with her gardening and charity work, meticulously maintaining the home as if preserving its outward perfection could mask the growing emotional void within. Richard, on the other hand, retreated into his work. His study became a sanctuary of sorts, the desk cluttered with financial reports and ledgers, his focus narrowing solely to his career. The couple rarely shared meals, and when they did, the silence between them was deafening. The once spirited conversations about their dreams and future were replaced by curt exchanges about bills, appointments, and grocery lists. Even the walls of their home seemed to absorb this absence of warmth, growing colder with every passing day. Margaret found herself wandering the empty halls at night, lost in the echoes of memories that now felt like a lifetime ago. Meanwhile, Richard stayed away for as long as possible, often working late or finding excuses to avoid the silence that awaited him. Ethan Brooks was a stark contrast to the Harpers' quiet despair. He moved into the neighborhood with the enthusiasm of someone eager to start fresh. In his early 20s, Ethan exuded a youthful confidence that was magnetic. A graphic designer by trade, Ethan often worked from home, his large bay window offering a clear view into the Harpers' brownstone. His presence was hard to ignore. Frequent morning jogs, cheerful chats with the elderly neighbor next door, and weekend projects that filled the air with the hum of power tools and laughter. Margaret was the first to notice him. She would occasionally watch him from the kitchen window, marveling at his energy and unyielding optimism. Richard, however, took a deeper interest. One chance encounter, where Richard offered to help Ethan with a heavy package, sparked a conversation that led to an unexpected camaraderie. Ethan's vibrant personality and earnest curiosity drew Richard in, offering a glimpse into a life that felt unattainable yet tantalizingly close. Richard Harper's growing interactions with Ethan Brooks felt like a lifeline. What began as occasional neighborly chats turned into long conversations over shared interests. Ethan's modern home, with its open spaces and creative energy, was a stark contrast to Richard's structured but emotionally sterile life. One afternoon, while helping Ethan set up a bookcase, Richard mentioned his love for literature, something he hadn't shared with anyone in years. Ethan, eager to connect, shared his favorite novels, suggesting they exchange books. This small gesture of trust marked the start of something deeper. Ethan admired Richard's quiet intellect and vulnerability, while Richard found Ethan's zest for life captivating. Ethan became the one person Richard felt he could confide in, sharing his frustrations with his marriage and the suffocating expectations of his life. Slowly, their bond moved beyond friendship into something neither of them fully understood but couldn't ignore. Ethan invited Richard to a cozy cafe one Sunday morning. The cafe's relaxed atmosphere, filled with the smell of freshly brewed coffee and soft acoustic music, set the stage for a vulnerable conversation. Richard admitted that he felt trapped in his life, a man who had built success on the outside but was crumbling within. Ethan listened intently, sharing his own struggles with relationships, including the challenges of being an openly gay man in a conservative world. The openness was intoxicating for Richard. For years, he had been weighed down by unspoken truths and a longing for connection. Ethan's candidness made Richard feel seen in a way he hadn't experienced in decades. It was during this conversation that Richard realized his feelings for Ethan weren't just admiration, they were something much deeper. For Ethan, the moment solidified what he had been sensing all along. His growing feelings for Richard were far more than platonic. But he also understood the complications, the risks of navigating such emotions with someone married and deeply conflicted. Richard and Ethan's relationship crossed an invisible boundary one quiet evening. Richard visited Ethan after a particularly volatile argument with Margaret, seeking solace. Ethan, ever empathetic, offered a listening ear and a warm presence. They spent hours talking in Ethan's living room, the tension between them palpable yet unspoken. As the evening turned into night, their proximity became intoxicating. Ethan brushed a strand of hair from Richard's forehead, a small, intimate gesture that made Richard's walls crumble. Without thinking, Richard kissed him. The kiss was electric, filled with longing and guilt. They pulled apart quickly, the enormity of the moment sinking in. Richard was overwhelmed. He had never allowed himself to feel this way, to embrace such vulnerability. For Ethan, the kiss was a bittersweet confirmation of feelings he'd tried to suppress. Over the next few days, they tried to maintain their distance, but their emotions drew them back together. Each meeting was laced with anticipation and risk, as Richard grappled with his identity and the consequences of his actions. Both men knew they were venturing into dangerous territory, but the pull of their connection was too strong to resist. Margaret's growing suspicion reached its peak. Richard's frequent absences distracted demeanor, and newfound lightness unsettled her. One evening, after Richard left the house claiming to attend a work meeting, Margaret followed him. She saw him enter Ethan's house. Through a window, she watched as Richard and Ethan shared an intimate embrace. The sight confirmed her worst fears and shattered her world. Her anger and heartbreak boiled over into a torrent of emotions. Richard returned home that night to find Margaret waiting. The confrontation was immediate and explosive. Margaret accused him of betraying her, not just with another person, but with a version of himself he had hidden from her for years. Richard, caught off guard, tried to explain his feelings but struggled to find the words. The argument escalated, with Margaret throwing objects and shouting accusations. Richard, overwhelmed and emotionally exhausted, left the house, seeking refuge at Ethan's place once again. Margaret's confrontation with Richard after uncovering his affair marked the darkest turning point in the Harper family's story. Fueled by a potent mix of betrayal, humiliation, and a sense of personal failure, Margaret's emotional state spiraled out of control. She had always prided herself on maintaining their picture-perfect life, but the revelation shattered that illusion. Richard, caught between guilt and defensiveness, tried to explain himself. He admitted to his feelings for Ethan, expressing a depth of vulnerability Margaret had never seen before. This only enraged her further, as she felt not just betrayed but replaced, her marriage, identity, and sense of self-worth all in ruins. As the argument escalated, Richard's desperate attempts to calm Margaret were drowned out by her sobs and accusations. She retreated upstairs, where her eyes fell on the revolver Richard had kept for security. Acting on a mix of impulsive rage and despair, she grabbed it. When Richard returned to the house later that night, after finding temporary refuge at Ethan's, Margaret was waiting. Their fight reignited, louder and more volatile than before. Ethan, concerned for Richard's safety, arrived moments later and attempted to intervene. In a moment of blinding rage, Margaret fired the gun. The first shot hit Richard in the chest, silencing his pleas and leaving him sprawled on the floor. Ethan's attempt to step in led to tragedy as Margaret, panicked and disoriented, fired again, striking him as well. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by Margaret's guttural sobs. She dropped the gun, staring at what she had done, her husband, lifeless, and Ethan, bleeding out. Both were gone gone before help could arrive. The aftermath of the violence was surreal. The once vibrant Harper home became a haunting crime scene. Margaret sat motionless as the police arrived, her hands trembling but otherwise resigned. She made no attempt to deny what she had done. The forensic team worked methodically, documenting every detail. The neighbors, awakened by the gunshots and flashing lights, gathered outside in hushed groups. The street, normally serene, was now alive with whispers, sirens, and the bright strobe of emergency lights. Richard's body was taken away first, covered by a stark white sheet. Ethan's death on the way to the hospital was another blow, turning the tragedy into a double homicide. Margaret was taken into custody, her face pale and emotionless. The Harper sons, Michael and James, were notified by the authorities. Their world collapsed as they struggled to comprehend the unimaginable. Both their father and mother were gone in different ways, their family irrevocably destroyed. The Harper neighborhood, once the epitome of suburban peace, became a whirlwind of activity and speculation after the tragedy. Neighbors who had previously exchanged pleasantries at backyard barbecues and holiday parties now found themselves at the center of a media frenzy. Satellite trucks lined the streets and reporters camped out on lawns, eagerly capturing sound bites and reactions. The neighbors' responses ranged from shock to morbid curiosity. For some, the events were incomprehensible. How could such a seemingly perfect family unravel so catastrophically? For others, the signs were clearer in hindsight. Richard's occasional absences, Margaret's forced smiles, and the subtle tension that lingered whenever they were seen together. Conversations at local coffee shops and grocery stores were dominated by the incident, each retelling laced with personal interpretations. Some neighbors rallied around Michael and James, offering condolences and meals, while others distanced themselves, wary of being caught in the chaos. The Harper house became a grim landmark. People slowed their cars as they passed, some craning their necks for a better look. Strangers left flowers, cards, and candles near the driveway, but these were often overshadowed by the constant buzz of photographers and true crime enthusiasts. The incident also fueled a divide within the community. A faction of neighbors blamed Richard for his affair, citing his betrayal as the catalyst. Others sympathized with Margaret, seeing her as a victim of emotional neglect who had snapped under pressure. Ethan's role further complicated matters. While some mourned him as an innocent victim, others whispered about the impropriety of his relationship with a married man. These whispered judgments created tension among longtime friends and neighbors, leaving an indelible mark on the once harmonious community. Grief unfolded in layers for those closest to the tragedy. For Michael and James, the loss of both parents, one to death and the other to prison, was a profound and complex burden. Publicly, they were forced to navigate a sea of reporters and well-wishers, their grief scrutinized and analyzed. Privately, they grappled with conflicting emotions: anger at their father for his infidelity, sorrow for their mother's actions, and a deep sense of abandonment. The brothers leaned on each other for support, but their paths to healing diverged. Michael, the elder, took on a protective role, managing legal matters and shielding his brother from invasive questions. James, younger and more vulnerable, struggled with depression and feelings of betrayal. Therapy sessions became a lifeline for both, providing a safe space to process their emotions. Ethan's family and friends faced their own unique grief. To them, Ethan was a kind, vibrant soul whose life was senselessly cut short. Vigils were held in his honor, with candles and photographs arranged in a poignant tribute. His death sparked broader conversations about acceptance, identity, and the risks faced by LGBTQ+ individuals in relationships that challenged societal norms. Meanwhile, Margaret's isolation in prison was marked by intense self-reflection. The initial weeks were spent in near silence, her mind replaying the events over and over. She refused visitors, unable to face her sons or anyone from her former life. Slowly, she began writing letters, long, anguished missives to Michael and James, expressing her remorse and attempting to explain the depth of her despair on that fateful night. Public memorials for Richard and Ethan were somber yet contentious. Attendees were divided, their sympathies split between the two men. For Margaret, there was little public acknowledgement. Her name became a symbol of the tragedy's darkest aspects. The community's grief was a collective weight, but it was also fragmented by unresolved tensions and unanswered questions. The trial of Margaret Harper became a drawn-out public spectacle that gripped not only the local community but the entire nation. What started as a local tragedy slowly expanded into a media event, with reporters, bloggers, and true crime enthusiasts analyzing every new development. The courtroom became the battleground for truth, empathy, and justice, where the central questions revolved around whether Margaret was truly guilty of second-degree murder or if her actions were the tragic outcome of long-term emotional abuse and despair. As the trial unfolded, the prosecution painted a damning picture of Margaret's actions. The opening statement emphasized her cold, calculated behavior, asserting that she had known exactly what she was doing when she shot her husband Richard in a fit of jealous rage. They presented evidence of Richard's affair with Ethan Brooks, including intimate text messages between the two men that painted a picture of betrayal. The prosecution argued that Margaret's motive was clear: revenge against her husband for his infidelity and the ensuing breakdown of their family. They painted her as a woman scorned who, unable to cope with the emotional weight of her broken marriage, took matters into her own hands. The defense, however, tried to portray Margaret in a different light. They argued that Margaret had been pushed to the edge by years of emotional neglect and isolation. Expert testimony from psychologists and psychiatrists suggested that Margaret had been suffering from a severe mental breakdown leading up to the fateful night, triggered by the discovery of her husband's affair and compounded by the years of her own emotional turmoil. They presented evidence of her declining mental state, citing instances of depression, anxiety, and an overwhelming sense of loneliness. Michael and James were among the most important witnesses in the trial. Their testimonies brought an emotional weight to the case that no amount of legal argument could replicate. Michael, the elder son, spoke of how Margaret had always been the anchor of their family, but how, over time, her behavior had changed, growing more erratic and withdrawn. He expressed his frustration at being unable to save her from her own personal demons. James, on the other hand, spoke with raw emotion about the loss of his mother and the devastation of realizing that the woman he had once loved and trusted had been capable of such violence. The media's coverage of the trial took on a life of its own, with the case becoming fodder for news outlets across the country. Social media users dissected every bit of testimony, offering their opinions on Margaret's guilt or innocence, often without full knowledge of the psychological complexity behind the tragedy. Public opinion was divided, with some viewing Margaret as a victim of her circumstances, while others saw her actions as unforgivable. After several weeks of tense legal arguments, the jury returned a verdict. Margaret was found guilty of second-degree murder, with a sentence of 25 years in prison. The decision sparked intense debate. Some saw the conviction as a necessary step in seeking justice for Ethan and Richard's families, while others believed that Margaret's mental health struggles should have been given more weight in the sentencing. In either case, the trial had irrevocably changed the lives of everyone involved, and its impact would be felt far beyond the walls of the courtroom. The repercussions of the tragedy and the trial echoed throughout the Harper community in ways that no one could have predicted. The once tight-knit neighborhood had been irrevocably altered, the bonds between families shattered by the events that had unfolded. People who had once considered themselves friends now found themselves on opposite sides of a moral divide, debating issues of justice, mental health, and the role of secrets in family life. Some residents, particularly those who had been close to the Harpers, struggled with feelings of betrayal and disbelief. The image of a perfect family, with Margaret and Richard at its center, had been deeply ingrained in the community's collective memory. Now the house that had once stood as a symbol of suburban bliss was a constant reminder of the darkness that could lurk beneath the surface of seemingly idyllic lives. The local church, which had often hosted gatherings and charity events for the Harper family, became a space for healing and discussion. While many still held on to traditional views about marriage and family, there were increasing calls for open conversations about mental health and the pressures that people face behind closed doors. Workshops and support groups for those dealing with emotional trauma and mental health issues began to sprout up, encouraging people to reach out for help before they reached a breaking point. Yet despite these positive changes, the community remained deeply divided. Some neighbors, unable to reconcile the image of Margaret as a loving mother with the woman who had taken a life, continued to distance themselves from the family. Others, however, took a more empathetic view, recognizing that Margaret's actions, while inexcusable, were the result of a long history of emotional turmoil that had gone unnoticed by those around her. In the aftermath, the Harper house remained vacant for many months. Its darkened windows and unkempt lawn became a grim monument to the tragedy. Eventually, it was sold to a new family, who moved in with hopes of moving past the memories. However, for many, the legacy of the Harper tragedy remained, seeping into the very fabric of the neighborhood. The stories of the Harper family's rise and fall were passed down through generations, reminding everyone of the fragile nature of outward appearances and the hidden struggles that often go unnoticed. While the Harper family tragedy was a personal calamity for those directly involved, its impact extended far beyond their immediate circle. The events that transpired and the questions they raised about love, loss, and mental health served as a stark reminder of the complexities of the human condition. Margaret, now in prison, was left to grapple with her actions in solitude. Her path to redemption was a long and painful one, marked by regret, guilt, and the yearning for forgiveness that would never come in the same way it once had. Over time, she became involved in prison programs focused on mental health, attempting to confront her demons and help others who struggled with similar emotional isolation. She wrote letters to her sons, each one filled with sorrow, and tried to explain herself in ways that her words might never fully convey. Her relationship with Michael and James, once fraught with tension and distance, became more distant. They continued to live their lives shaped by the events, but also determined to move forward. For Michael and James, the pain of losing both their parents, one to death and the other to prison, was a wound that never fully healed. They each followed their own paths of recovery. Michael took up a career in law, driven by a desire for justice and fairness, while James pursued psychology, hoping to better understand the complexities of human behavior. Both brothers became passionate advocates for mental health awareness, speaking publicly about the struggles they had faced growing up in a family filled with secrets and unresolved trauma. Ethan's family, while devastated by his loss, found some semblance of peace in the wake of the trial. They worked tirelessly to establish a foundation in Ethan's name, focusing on the issues of LGBTQ+ rights, mental health advocacy, and promoting acceptance and understanding within families. His legacy, though marked by tragedy, became a powerful symbol of the importance of love and acceptance for those who live outside societal norms. The Harper case ultimately became a case study in both the fragility and resilience of the human spirit. It illuminated the destructive power of secrets and the devastating consequences of unchecked emotional turmoil, but it also offered a lesson in redemption, healing, and the possibility of change. In the end, the tragedy left behind a legacy not just of pain but of awareness and a renewed commitment to addressing the complexities of the human heart. As the story of the Harper family concludes, we invite you, the viewers, to reflect on the lessons it imparts. What do you think was the root cause of the tragedy? Was Margaret simply a victim of circumstances, or were her actions unforgivable? How do you think the neighborhood and the individuals involved can begin to heal after such a devastating event? We want to hear from you. Leave your thoughts in the comments below and don't forget to like and subscribe for more content. Your feedback is important to us as we continue to explore the complexities of human relationships and the stories that shape our world. Do you believe in redemption after such a tragedy? How can communities rebuild trust and understanding in the wake of such pain? Let us know your perspective. Your voice matters. Thank you for watching, and we hope this story has given you new insights into the complexities of life, love, and the consequences of unspoken truths. See you in the next episode.